What could the Russian invasion of Ukraine mean for our relationship with China? I'm joined now by Oriana Schuyler Mastro from the Centre, a Centre Fellow at Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies at Stanford University. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon in the UK. First, I just wanted to ask you, how important is Europe versus Asia to American foreign policy today?
Well, I think in general, people try to avoid the comparison, Europe versus Asia. But if put on the spot, I think even European countries would admit that Asia is a very dynamic region and is the region of the future. This is the economic engine of the world. The vast majority of the population lives there. And in terms of security interests, the United States has significant security interests in Asia that are much more threatened by China than the capabilities of the Russians to threaten our interests in Europe.
And what has China's response been, in your understanding, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
The Chinese have tried to take a relatively neutral line, but at the same time use this invasion as a warning to the United States and European countries. Their propaganda line is that the West pushed Russia and beyond Russian red lines with the eastern expansion of NATO, and therefore the United States caused this conflict. They're using the same line on Taiwan, saying that the United States consistently pushes its red lines and doesn't take into account great power security interests. So if something happened over Taiwan, it would be the United States' fault and not China's fault. Now, of course, the West, the United States, U.S. allies and partners might not buy into this narrative, but many countries do in the world, and that's a problem.
But there has been international kind of condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, do you think that the almost Western unity in response to this will kind of bolster China's position in the sense of, would they be worried, or do you think that this will actually be something that they're not bothered about?
So I think the Chinese are surprised with the degree to which the United States and its allies and partners came together in condemnation against Russia, and in particular put economic sanctions on Russia. But I don't think it changes their calculus on Taiwan. First and foremost, for China, Taiwan is so important that they would be able to weather this degree of sanction. Secondly, countries are not going to sanction China like they're sanctioning Russia. Most countries don't have the same dependency on Russia as they do on China. One example I like to give is Singapore, who very proudly put sanctions on Russia, but their trade with Russia is less than $3 billion a year, while they trade almost $60 billion with the Chinese. As I've talked to people in the region, they say there's no situation in which they would sanction China like this, just because their economies would be crippled so much more so than China's. So I think while the Chinese are interested in how Russia has been treated in the response to this invasion, it hasn't given them any pause when it comes to a potential use of force over Taiwan.
And do you think that that might undermine kind of Western moral authority if we are treating China differently when it comes to actions that they are doing that may contravene the international rule-based order?
Well, absolutely. But for the past 25 years, most countries have put their economic interests over any other types of interests. And China has purposefully designed its foreign policies to convince countries of the world that Taiwan is a unique scenario that's not indicative of how they are as a country as a whole, and that those countries should put those economic ties above all. So the question becomes, are we really here to protect an order, norms and principles of that order, regardless of the cost? Or is economic prosperity the number one priority? Some countries might feel one way, some countries might feel another way, but I think we have to be honest about where we stand on these issues.
But there has been long-standing concerns expressed. I mean, there's been concerns about, for example, in the UK, Chinese involvement in our strategic infrastructure. Huawei also kind of Chinese influence in terms of universities and jobs and manufacturing moving to China. I mean, why do you think there hasn't been much political will to kind of take those concerns seriously?
Well, I think the security concerns that the United States is considering with respect to China in some ways are very different than those of Europe. China made a huge misstep with their political interference, such as having the Confucius Institutes, trying to teach people of the Chinese position on things, have countries and elites support the Chinese government political views and not condemn them on human rights, et cetera, et cetera. That really, I think, went to the heart of a lot of domestic politics. And that's why I believe countries in Europe started to notice the China threat. But for the United States, it's also a very conventional military threat. The Chinese military has increased its spending by over 700% in the past couple of years, and they can now take on the U.S. military in Asia. They have a formidable Navy, largest in the world, Air Force, nuclear program that's increasing. So this is the real focus of the United States. However, European countries are not directly threatened territorially by China. And for that reason, I think, and maybe rightfully so, their focus is on Russia.
And just finally, what do you think America should be doing with its China policy? Do you think anything should change? And if yes, what?
The best China policy is not really about U.S.-China relations. It's about the United States and the rest of the world. It's other countries in the world that decide who's going to be powerful, who's going to be the leader. My biggest critique of U.S. policy to date, of course, we need to build up our military to maintain deterrence in Asia. But we also have to think about how domestic politics is increasing our economic leadership and be open to free trade. And lastly, U.S. policy prioritizes certain allies and partners and largely ignores the developing world, where 80% of the world lives. China is actively trying to become the leader of that world. So unless the United States starts to think about what do countries want in this new era, what are new institutions we can build, what are new innovations we can promote, then we are always going to be left behind.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Oriana Schuyler Mastro at the Center Fellow of Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies at Stanford University. We're just going to get some reaction from Charlie before we move on to our next subject. I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think that we treat China differently to Russia? And do you think that we should be taking a stronger line when it comes to Chinese behaviour on the international stage? Or should we be bringing them closer to us?
Well, we definitely should approach them from a different angle. First and foremost, as Oriana points out, I mean, the consumption of Russian products is completely different to the consumption of Chinese. So should a similar scenario occur in Taiwan with the Chinese invasion, quite like the Russian invasion into Ukraine, Oriana is right. I think there'd be no justification for the same level of sanctions because there's no opportunity and defence for it. I mean, even as the international order is putting this huge amount of crippling economic sanctions on Russia, they are still consuming Russian energy products at a high rate. Some countries even signing more contracts to consume more oil and gas from Russia. We cannot do the same with China. The reasons just expressed, in that it is the industry workhorse of the world. It is the warehouse where most of those products are produced.
Should we be rethinking that? Should we be doing things to change that? I mean, some of the discussions, during Brexit was the post-industrial communities being deprived, and we talk about, new green technology. Should we be thinking innovatively in terms of infrastructure in order to be less dependent on other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for too long we've relied on the simple logic of thinking if the world trades more, it fights less. But clearly we are not seeing that is the direction the world is heading right now as superpowers jostle for positions in the world. It is right, I think, that in order to move away from a just threatening position against China, we should seek to cripple them by building at home, looking for alternative sources of energy from Russia, for example. Instead of consuming all of that gas and blinding our defence policy and our strategy in Europe, perhaps instead we could look to building more nuclear plants at home.
And what do you think, Charlie, about this idea of spheres of influence? Because a lot of the time when other countries seem to violate many of our norms, rather than, express concern about, for example, invasions or incursions, you say, oh, this is violating democratic or liberal values, but those countries don't profess to be liberal democracies. I mean, do you think that we should be accepting that, or should we be trying to change that within those countries?
I think a level of acceptance is long overdue. There is, I believe, in many of these first world powers, a degree of, I would say, international arrogance about the way to run things, which is especially galling after 2 decades of foreign policy failures in the Middle East and North Africa, Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya. These are places where we attempted to change the democratic system, well, to make it democratic. And clearly that hasn't worked. So in this situation, I think the adjustment to being more appreciative of different regional spheres of influence and different ways that the other countries work, that's long overdue.
And Germany has just made some commitments to massively increasing defence spending. Obviously, these are some things that a lot of countries in Europe and the West thought were behind us in terms of remilitarisation and so on. I mean, what do you make of that? Do you think that actually we've been lacklustre when it comes to building our defences, when it comes to the military and so on? Do you think that we should be rebuilding that?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been lacklustre in the extreme. I mean, when the last US President, Donald Trump, raised these points in Europe, saying that for too long, significant portions of NATO have relied on American support to act, he was laughed out of the room. People said, oh, it's ridiculous. How could you possibly say this? And, of course, everything Trump said was treated with disdain and scorn anyway. But he was absolutely right. And now, I hope, what's happened in Europe will inspire more than just Germany, plenty of other countries to rebuild and rearm. And actually, I would like to see less American involvement in Europe. I want my continent to be able to defend itself. I don't want to have to rely on tanks from Indiana. I want men and women of Italy, France, Germany, England to fight.
But do you think that we have the confidence to do those kinds of things? Because I think that one of the things that's been really striking over the last few weeks is that it seems to have really shocked Europe. We hear a lot of this, that history is back, that there was this sense that there was the end of history and that the kind of liberal sphere was stable and nothing will ever disrupt it. And in some senses, that has meant that we've been asleep at the wheel, as some people put it. I mean, do you think that we have the confidence to argue for a strong military? Because underpinning that militarism, in a sense, is this idea of kind of patriotism and self-sacrifice and kind of duty and responsibility, values that seem to have been argued against and discredited within the West itself.
Yeah, I think so. And I increasingly look with nervousness at polling about what portion of certain countries in Europe people will be willing to fight and indeed die for its service and its defence. These numbers generally dwindle. But I think in times of crisis like we're seeing now, I hope, and I expect it will, reinvigorate a sense of European civilisation. And this is something worth fighting and preserving. And actually, even if these numbers dwindle, you don't need the entire population to want to fight. There will always be those who are willing to stand up and do the business.